Right. So we are back now. I'm going to turn it over to the superintendent to introduce Grace for this workshop.
Sure. Dr. Valenzuela, who I think you all know, is here this evening. And as we've been previewing the last couple of weeks, she'll be giving us an update on the multilingual intake. So students that we've been recently welcoming into our schools and over the course of the year. And then Carlos Gomez, our Director of Language Development, is going to join Grace at the end to talk a little bit about implications from a staffing perspective, giving some historical context as well as what we're looking at today. So we'll pass it off to you, Grace.
Good evening, everybody. So happy to be here. Hope you had a great weekend. So I'm going to start by definition of terms. So I will be using some language words, vocabulary words, and I want to make sure that we're all familiar and we're on the same page in terms of those words. So, so you will hear that multilingual learners, and these are students with a primary home language spoken at home is other than English. And so we identify them, the students with this identification as multilingual, in completing a state form called the Language Use Survey upon enrollment. Not all multilingual learners are identified as English learners. So there are students who don't need English language development support services. So I'm calling them, those are the multilingual English learners. So students who need language support services after taking an English language assessment at intake. So there is an initial eligibility form. It's a documented form that is provided to parents as part of the federal legal requirement. Another word that you will hear tonight is McKinney-Vento. So these are students who are children and youth who lack a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. So the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act authorizes the federal education for homeless children and youth. And it is primary piece of federal legislation that is related to the education of young people experiencing homelessness. So just further definition. So McKinney-Vento are those students who share the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reasons. They may be living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds due to lack of alternative adequate accommodations. They could be living in emergency or transitional shelters and living in a public or private place not designated for or regularly used as accommodations. They could be living in cars, abandoned buildings, parks, substandard housing, bus, or train stations or similar settings. They could also be living with other people, so they're doubled up or tripled up in a housing that is also not identified as adequate shelter for families. So the next slide is that I will also use the word language access. So this describes the services that agencies use to bridge the communication barrier with individuals who cannot speak, understand, read, or write English fluently. So as an agency, an institution, we use this word as well to provide language access to individuals with limited English. A refugee is a person who has fled their own country because they are at risk of serious human rights violations and persecution in their country of origin. And asylum seeker is a person who has left their country and is seeking protection from persecution and serious human rights violation in another country. But they haven't received the legally recognized status of a refugee and is waiting to receive a decision on their asylum claim. So those are some of the terms that I'll be using tonight. And so operating in this vocabulary words. The multilingual intake process. Did I miss a slide, Aaron? Something. Is the org chart there? Could you? Okay, I think I should do that first. Okay. So you might be wondering, why am I talking about enrollment? So just so you have an understanding of my responsibilities. So my responsibility includes oversight of the district enrollment and registration of all students in the district, to ensure accurate student data according to federal and state laws in accordance with district procedures and policies. The district created 4 registrar stipended positions to assist in the maintenance and management of student information in Infinite Campus, Portland Public Schools enrollment database system. 3 of the registrars have a suite of schools they're responsible for, and one of them is and one of the 4 registrars is assigned to do registration specifically for multilingual students, and that staff member is at the Multilingual Center. So that's my responsibility under enrollment. And Portland Language Access is another responsibility. So Portland Public Schools recognizes the special needs of members of linguistic and cultural minority groups who are limited English proficient. And in order to ensure equal access to public education, Portland Public Schools is committed to providing access to interpreter and translation services during school hours for all students and or family members who have legal access to the students and who need services for school business. Language access, the board has adopted IHBC BEC policy of translation and interpretation services, and my office provides oversight to ensure policy implementation. The other bullet there in my responsibility is McKinney-Vento. That's a recent addition to my suite of portfolio. Given the fact that most of our McKinney-Vento students are multilingual, it just made sense for my department to provide oversight for this service. And then Aaron, we want to move to the next one with the intake. Yes. So Portland Public Schools has been a refugee resettlement site since the early 1980s, when we began receiving multiple families a week. Schools were not able to respond immediately, and so they had to scramble for interpreters, and a professional staff had to drop what they're doing to accommodate families. So for families with children at various levels, they also had to go to 3 different schools to complete the same enrollment forms. So it didn't make sense. It wasn't efficient and welcoming to families. So we started centralizing intake for multilingual students in the mid-1990s for efficiency, consistency in policy implementation, test assessment validity, and data accuracy. So our intake process is one that is a model for many districts across the country, including Maine. And since we have had this system in operation for close to 30 years, we have polished and revised the process based on key learnings we have learned over the many years since inception. So at intake, we enroll, we provide English language screening, we administer the assessment, we complete a family and educational history for all new students. We complete Infinite Campus registration and all the edits to registrations. We coordinate with food service, transportation, housing programs, social services, community organizations. And so we do those kinds of referrals as well. And then we set up meet and greet at the receiving school. So once the family has completed their registration at intake, they know what bus to take. They know where the school is they're supposed to be. So those are the things that we do at intake. It takes a long time to complete an intake because remember that we are, most of the time doing that translation interpretation. I was actually doing language assessment yesterday, and it really takes a long time to complete the screening process. So this is the historical count. Hence, we have data since this one I put in since 2000. Again, in the 1980s, 90s, as an outcome of conflict in Vietnam, the arrivals of refugees in Portland came from Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And they were arriving since 2000, arriving up to 2000. And in the mid-1990s, it shifted. We started receiving refugees from Africa, Sudan, and Somalia, the Congo in particular. Our enrollment reflects the result of political conflict, civil war all over the world. So, and I want you to notice the entry for this year, which is 612 students, and we're only in March. That number is up to end of January. And we have a lot of kids still and they keep coming. So the rest of them, the numbers there are numbers that are full year numbers. So I just want to highlight that. And I'll come back to that I'll talk more about that number in detail. So I just want to look at this in terms of what it means for U.S. refugee admissions and resettlement ceilings. It's an important one to look at. So there, if you look at this, there are peaks and valleys. So the blue line is actually the admission number by the federal government. And then the red one is the actual. So the previous administration policy on refugee resettlement and admission affected arrivals of refugees, and yet our numbers had been steady as a result of the arrival of asylum-seeking immigrants. So while the refugee admission ceiling has increased in the Biden administration, the numbers have not been realized in the last 2 years. And in my experience, the actual shift in enrollment for us happens a year or two post legislation passage. So while we have fewer arrivals compared to 1990s and 2000s, our number are still high because of the asylum-seeking individuals. And enrollment in the last 6 years really is driven by asylum seekers, most of whom had a very difficult and traumatic displacement and journey to the United States. And as a result, many of these students have very limited or interrupted formal education. So these are the numbers of students. This is data from September to January. So the number we always have account the numbers of students we screen in the spring of the year before for pre-K and K. So those numbers are added to that number because they start in September. So those are the new language minority numbers in September. And in January, we had 75 kids that we registered for a total of 612. Which is almost double the number of, students. It's 200 more. Most of the students also are young, so they are in elementary school, they're elementary age. So 379 elementary students compared to 82 middle schoolers and 151 high school students. this is how they are placed right now in terms of looking at what schools are impacted by the enrollment. I want to highlight that we have some considerations in placing students. Number one would be available staff members in the building, the class sizes of the classrooms that we are assigning kids by grade level, and also access to transportation. And with the current situation that we are in with families at the warming shelter, it's much better for us to assign students in schools with that has a late start, because that allows the family time to get back to the shelter for yellow bus pickup. So that's why some of the enrollment, like Prasumskat is a late start school, as well as Waikiki. So just those are considerations. And the ones that are, I just want to make sure the other ones are, I will not remember, St. Elizabeth's, the YFO, those are our pre-K programs. And this is the distribution for middle school and high school. So at one point, we had to stop enrollment in October for Portland High School since they started the year with really high enrollment. So we placed a lot of kids at Deering at the start of the year and then shifted back. So now it's being balanced right now. But still, Deering has more kids. And also, King is the recipient of most of our McKinney-Vento students. Currently, these are the top languages. So if you note the numbers of, of Portuguese speakers, it's more than double the next highest language group. And so that's the demand for Portuguese speakers is high. These are the languages that are spoken by the students. I just want to note that sometimes, in many cases with our families whose kids speak Portuguese, the parents actually speak Lingala. Because they originally come from another country. Just want to, I also have the handout. This one is an interesting, point of data. I just want to say that these are the top 20 language count from 1999 to, it's not, I forgot to change the date. It's to the present, to 2023. So if you will look at that number, this handout, there are languages that we had up in 2000 that are no longer, that were not there, like Portuguese. And they are now the top language. So there's a shift. You could see we started with a lot of Khmer speakers, and then it became Somali as a language group. And now the Somali is no longer the language group that is the top language group in Portland Public Schools. It's now Portuguese. So it's an interesting one to understand in terms of the need for us to be flexible with the demand of languages for our students and families. I think, Erin, I highlighted in the next slide. I didn't. What happened to it? So these are them. I just want to note that at one point we also had Serbians Serbo-Croatian speakers. They are the fourth language group. Really don't have that, that group speaking that language now. So on the top 20 languages. We didn't have Arabic just 7 years ago, but now it's one of our top 4 languages. It's number 4 on our list. So that's an important one to understand. So I'm going to shift to our McKinney-Vento count by school. So at the start of the year, we opened with about 259 students. And now we are, in January, we have 457 students, 37 students who are McKinney-Vento. And these are how they're distributed in the different schools. We actually have going to have more than 500 kids right now because there are many families that are losing their jobs at Abbott Labs. And so we are seeing eviction notices for families. So that's another thing that families with housing are now going to be losing their housing because they couldn't afford the rent. So the numbers of our McKinney-Vento go up and down, most of the time up. We've never seen this kind of number ever. And so for our intake, so not everybody is, new students. So other McKinney-Vento they have been enrolled as students. They may lose housing, and that's why they became McKinney-Vento students, or they're transferred from some other districts. So in October, 61% of our intake registrations were McKinney-Vento. In November, we had 90%. 78% in December, 80% in January. So it really is an average of about 75% of new students are McKinney-Vento. And we're also seeing an increase in the number of students who are unaccompanied youth. And they live at the teen shelter. And 79% of the students who arrive require EL support services. 83% are multilingual. So if you can see, there are 4% students who are multilingual, but they don't need ELD services. And there are also 17% who are never else. So this is an important one to understand, and Carlos will be able to explain this after I speak. So English language development eligibility, as I said at the start, this is a form that is required by the federal government to notify families that their child will be receiving English language support services. And IELD stands for Intensive English Language Development. So they're the lower level on English proficiency, and cognitive academic language skills is CAL. So they are on a higher end. And then we have exited English learners and those who are not ELS, and some of them are pending based on completion of assessment. That's why they're pending. So this is just the start of the data from intake. As you know, as some of you know, I used to run not just the multilingual, I also run what Carlos is doing in terms of the academic, the language development for students. I have not seen this kind of number. It was reversed. So in other words, when I was running the program just 7 years ago, we had 80% of our students were CALs. So they are, intermediate to advanced level. And that's why the need was from something like Make It Happen to move them to the next level for support, for academic development. This is a new development, this very recent. And the first word to understand is the word intensive. So if they need intensive programming, they really need a teacher who will provide that intensive language development support. It's not a one block. It's not 1 block a day. It's not going to be enough for them to reach the level of CAPS. So we really need to provide that kind of intensive language development support for these students. And these are high numbers. So just for, my staffing for language access, the ones that are I just want to note that not all of our staff is full-time. So, and not all of them are locally funded. So there are some languages that are, there is an asterisk, and those are a combination of locally funded and grant funded. So that's the distribution of our FTE. And as you see, if the number is going down, like Khmer has lower number, then we move it out. We used to have Serbians, we used to have Russians. And once we don't need those support services, we have to transition. We have to be really flexible in addressing the needs of the current students we have in our midst. So right now, the demand is for Portuguese, Lingala, French, and Spanish. And I think that's. So, yeah. Do you have questions, or do you want to do the questions, or
Carlos.
what do you want to do?
I think we should have Carlos, because some of yours is recall. So why don't you do that, and then we can ask all together.
Good evening, everybody. Good to be with you again. So just as Malia said, a little bit of recall. So I've attached a few slides from last week's presentation, which we can move to. And as a reminder, we in the Language Development Department, which is part of the academics team, support the teaching and learning of our multilingual students. So when we started the school year back in August and September of 2022, these were the ESOL teacher. ESOL stands for English to Speakers of Other Languages, to multilingual student ratios. We were at around 18-1 at the pre-K level, about 26-1 at the elementary, and 29-1 at the secondary level. That's just for our ESOL teachers. If you include our ESOL staff, which is also not just teachers, but language ed techs, which Grace was just talking about, the ratios were a little bit lower. The elementary 1-23 and 1-25 at the secondary. So that's what we presented last week. So hopefully that looks familiar to you. Again, that was at the beginning of the school year, and with the context that Grace just gave, you would expect those ratios to be a little bit higher, which they are at this point mid-year, and they'll probably be a little higher towards the end of this year. And then I added a bullet point here just to give you a sense of, over the last couple of years, the Lao Plan investments and some of the equity moves that we made over the last 2 fiscal years, especially, increased the number of ESOL teachers, including one at PATHS. Most of our additions were at the elementary school. We also had an increase in pre-K dual language learner teachers and a district position, multilingual special ed coordinator. So those are positions that were added in the last two fiscal years. On the next slide, Same as last time, just a reminder of the methodology that we use, and just want to emphasize here that our Lao plan, our Portland Public Schools Lao plan, is our blueprint roadmap, if you will, of how we serve our multilingual students, of how we ensure that they have access to high academic achievement, rigorous standards, and also that they are developing their English language, which we are obliged to do. We take into consideration some of the best research-based practices and some of the audits and studies that we've received from the Center for Applied Linguistics to help us understand how to best use the resources that we have to support our multilingual learners. And one of the key things that gets factored into this methodology is who our students are. And Grace gave you a little sample of IELD versus CALS level. And just to kind of drive that point home or paint the picture a little bit clearer, an IELD student might be somebody who speaks multiple languages, but in English is speaking at the word level or at the phrase level, is starting to memorize. There's a lot of memorization at this point. There's a lot of communication with visuals, gestures, and just sort of starting to develop those English language skills to be able to communicate basic needs. When students get to a cognitive academic language skills level, a level 3 or 4 on or plus on access, you might mistake a student as somebody fluent in English, can have interactions with you, can speak with you, and communicates very clearly and very well in an oral setting. But in terms of literacy, in terms of reading comprehension, in terms of writing, that's more complex. That's where we start getting into the academic language, right? So the language of science, the language of social studies, of math. These are complex, multi-meaning words depending on where you are. A plane is different in a math class than in a PE class than in a social studies class. And maybe some other class with a different spelling, PLAIN. Anyway, so the intensive English language development is that our Lao plan calls for twice as much English development. We're committing to up to 2 blocks of learning per day in English development, whereas the CALS level student might have one block a day committed to English language development. And it's important to note that the ESOL staff, whether teachers or ed techs, that's just a portion of the student's day. In fact, the majority of the student's day, over half, maybe 3/4 to 4/5 of their day, is in a general education language classroom. And the ESOL teacher supports, the language ed tech supports, pushing into class, preferably, giving students further explanation in their home language so that the content becomes clear, so that their literacy in that language increases, so that their literacy in English increases. So it's really important for our general educators to be able to support our multilingual students. We can't do it alone with just ESOL teachers. This is a full community effort to ensure that our Lao plan commitments are met. You've seen the other factors there, and you've heard from them, from Grace about them. So we can skip to the next slide. This next slide, I just added today just to give you a sense of the last couple of years, our total number of multilingual learners who receive English language development services. Notice this is affected by a couple of factors, including the pandemic. There was the addition and growth of the pre-K program, and the remote learning, the hybrid learning, all of these things factor into that total number of multilingual learners. To reemphasize what Grace said earlier, the second row there gives you a sense of how many more students we are receiving that do require that intensive English language development. So we are adjusting our resources to meet the needs of the students in front of us on a weekly, monthly basis. That number is through January, so we expect that to be even higher probably by the end of the school year. There was a question last week around number of students who are dual identified. In other words, multilingual learners who receive special education services. The number has increased over the last few years, but also the total number of multilingual learners has increased. So we're still roughly in the 15 to 16% range, which is in line with the non-multilingual student numbers. And then I didn't add this, but in terms of staffing, well, I guess on the previous point, there is 20 or so additional ESOL staff. That still keeps us at about 1 to 29, 1 to 30 student ratio. And again, depends on the level. The younger students have a smaller ratio. And some of our schools that receive many multilingual learners, their ratio keeps increasing, gets higher, and then we try to adjust that with staffing and other means. So that's just a sense of where we are with our staff, we're revisiting this on a monthly basis with schools. That's it.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to questions now from the board. Board Member Opperman, yeah.
Wow. It's pretty significant part of what we have to do in this district. My question, a couple of different questions. You mentioned that the teacher, initial teacher is the teacher in the classroom, the regular ed teacher and all, and you have the ESOL teacher assisting. They don't necessarily translate though.
Right. There are basically three functions for the ESOL teacher: direct English instruction, collaboration with the general educator, and case management. So ensuring that the student's individual language plans are up to date, knowing the student, bringing data and evidence to all of that work. So that it's a sort of a three-pronged approach that ESOL teachers have. Part of that is collaborating with gen ed teachers. Sometimes it is co-teaching. Sometimes it's direct English instruction in small settings or in push-in situations.
So to ask how you would implement this ideally, I have mental pictures of what would be great. I particularly think of the elementary classroom, K-5, because there seem to be quite a few students there. What would be the ideal of third grade situation? You have 3 third grade classrooms with a large percent of ELL students.
Well, we know that students learn from their peers. So as much as we can keep students together and not pull them, that is part of the ideal. Having 3 third grade teachers with a 660 endorsement or well-versed in knowing how to work with multilingual learners would be part of that equation. Collaboration time for the ESOL teacher to work with those 3 grade level teachers to co-plan, to co-assess would be part of the equation. Some level of coordination among those 3 teachers so that there's a fluid grouping situation would be part of that ideal, I think, as well.
Can I add one point to that? I also think that, and this is connected to something that Carlos pointed out, but having all classroom and general ed teachers trained, and in the language principles is something that is important given the number of multilingual learners we have in our system. At this point, all of our teachers are ESOL teachers. And so one of the parts of the collaboration that Carlos mentioned is around growing colleagues' skills, knowledge, and mindset pertaining to teaching students who are multilingual learners. But we're also having conversations about what might be possible in the future where, that's part of being a teacher in Portland Public Schools is having a certain credential or certification and that baseline training and that assumption about what it means to be an educator here when you walk in to positions in our school district. So when you're asking about the ideal, I just wanted to make that point as well.
Thank you. I'm going to see if there's other questions, and then if you still have some more. Vice Chair Bondo, did I see your hand? Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions, but I'm just going to combine them on some 2 or 3. So when I look at the new arrival, I think here when we have, I think the 612, then we see, and when I look at the key inventory is like a 437, right? And then when I do the math, we have like a 175 remaining. Can we know exactly which categories they belong to?
In terms of English language development,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I can find that out, but I don't have that information
Okay.
right now.
So here, when I look at it, and we're just reporting the new arrival, right? But I know what's going on to the city. We have housing issues, and a lot of families are leaving the district, so they're going to other cities. So do we have only the number? Can we get the number of how many students have left the district because of the housing issue?
Yep.
Can I have it?
Yeah, that one we can search. Sometimes families don't report to us.
But we have those students in our file, right? So when we don't see them in the school, and if we don't see them, coming for intake, so we know then they are no.
Oh, you mean they have an appointment and then they didn't show up?
On both sides. I mean, being at school or they just left for another district. So at least we can combine how many we are receiving right now because we just see the number and how many have left. So we can balance exactly what's going on here. So I try to have that one in my mind to see the investment. If we have to make investment, if it's making sense.
Yes.
Right. And,
but I just want to point out that of the McKinney-Vento students, 79% of them are English learners.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And we have a family, community families specialists, right? Who really do we know the ratio on the need? I mean, how many, like a French speaker community specialist, how many families they can handle? The ratios on the families, because it's so important to know. We have only 2 FTEs for the French and Portuguese. As the balance with the ratio of the families, or we just use them as needed?
Actually, we have that ratio, but I don't have that information with me. In terms of the caseload that they have,
right?
There are some languages that are really high.
Okay. So, can I have a follow-up with you?
Yes, please.
And I've been concerned here on when I look at on the 2022 investment that we have done for the law plan and the 15.5 FTs on the all EOL languages. So I'm still wondering a little bit about on the ELD eligibility, why we have a less exceeded on the languages. When I see the trend is now really moving forward, and I see we keep having increase on the number of a student with dual identification since 2020 to now, I still have the number in my head for those years. So I try to understand why we have less exceeded. When I look at what we provide in the classroom, you just mentioned and what Ms. Juliana, she just asked us. So we have a 3 levels collaboration in the classroom. So we have a less excited on the language. So I just want to understand what kind of challenges happening. We have some learning strategies happening in the classroom, or what's the issue? Because we want to add more because we have newcomers, but I just don't see the outcomes or what we see. I keep seeing numbers going. We keep adding stuff, but I just don't see how we improving that area right now.
So, Vice Chair Bondo, if I may on this, just the ELD eligibility, the slide here, this was the assessment data that the intake team, when a student is enrolling in the district, what classification there. So these are students we have yet to serve.
Yes.
Right. So Grace's point in highlighting this was historically upon initial assessment in their enrollment, the majority of students had been in CALS. What we have now seen in recent years, and as you can see in these months and this year, just in the enrollments that they have done over the course of these months, as students are coming to us, they are needing IELD services. So these are students that we have yet to provide instruction to. This assessment data is taken on the point of enrollment. I think your question, which is, another one for us to talk about, is on the access data, the annual test that we do of English language proficiency, what kind of progress we're seeing there. So that data is not part of the presentation, but I believe that's.
I would like to have a side by side because it's making more sense when you can see what we have improved and what we just come out with the enrollment now and look at, okay, this is exactly what we have as a figure compared to what we see happening in the strategy plan. Right. I think I will be stopping right now again. Maybe I can have some follow-up questions later. Thank you.
All right, I've got Board Member Bryden, followed by Youssef, and then Board Member Russell Vetter.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to voice my appreciation for all that information in the presentation. And I'm cognizant of the fact that, we're talking about a group of students that needs and deserves a lot of intensive resources. I'm hopeful that somebody could talk a little bit about what federal and state funding mechanisms might be available to help us provide those services that they need and deserve. I'm not sure who's the best person to answer that question, but that's my question.
Probably do a team approach on this, but from one lever or one source is Title III grants. So that's specifically for multilingual learners. That includes professional development, additional supports for multilingual learners, and parent engagement, family engagement. So there is some funding that we use from, all the funding for Title III is used for multilingual learners. There are additional funding sources.
Do you want to speak to the recent grant?
I just want to say that these are our students. So we are responsible for enrolling and educating them like any other kid. So the Title III that Carlos was talking about, it is supplemental. So a classroom teacher is basic. We should be able to provide that. That's required by law. You want me to talk about the ELL chip fund?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Grace, if you could speak to the so 2 other funding sources, one the McKinney-Vento, and then the recent hardship funding from the state.
Yes, we recently received from the state $1.6 million to help us with McKinney-Vento students and English learners. That money is only good up to September 30 of 2023.
Sorry, did I hear correctly that that was received recently and it's available to use up until the end of September?
Yes.
Do we have a sense of whether a similar amount of support will be available for the rest of the next academic year? Or are we still,
No,
that's still a question mark?
It's still the same as COVID relief money funds that they have set aside for this. So it is, and the rest of our COVID money is through 2024, but this one is 2023.
Okay. Thank you.
And also kind of as we've been working along with the city and looking at state advocacy around funding, we've also become aware of an ELL hardship money that is in the budget for this year. And there's also ongoing legislation to increase that money. It's over to hopefully be over $1 million. So that's another venue that we're going to be looking at applying for funds within that pool that already exists. And Board Member Grant, I know that's kind of in your wheelhouse. So
yeah, I just wanted, I think your statement actually clarified my confusion, but the 1.6 million you just quoted, is that just the McKinney-Vento money?
McKinney-Vento and English learners.
So it's those two things combined. So we have some ELL hardship money as part of that 1.6 from the last budget. Okay, thank you.
So I think we should actually double check on that because I don't think we received the specific ELL hardship fund from last year. But we did receive the McKinney-Vento 1.6 million.
I think the challenge that we have, it's not the same as in previous years when we are the only game in the state. When we were the only game, in other words, we were the only recipient of English language learners. So right now we are competing with, they're now spread out because of the numbers. So we're not the only school district experiencing the hardship. It's in, it's in Westbrook, it's in South Portland, and it's in Augusta, in Lewiston, Brunswick. So it's all in Biddeford. So the state, when they divvy up the money, they allotted percentages to go to, to those districts as well, based on the numbers of students.
Okay, I'm going to go to Board Member Youssef.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Carlos and Grace, for the presentation. Carlos, you said we adjust our resources due to the need of the students, which reminds me one of the schools I visit, and they shared with us that they have received 7 new students, and they were not ready for it. And I just would like to walk me through the process, how we handle that, and who do they talk to, and how urgent can that be handled?
So when a school begins to receive students throughout the school year, so as they come in September, October, November, and they're approaching 40, 50, 60, 70 additional students, usually what happens is we'll be in constant conversation with multilingual intake, kind of keeping track of where students are placed, where the available grade level spots are. This is mostly elementary, but it affects specific schools. King, Deering, Reiki, I think would probably be the top 3. Typically an administrator or member of the ESOL teaching team will reach out to me or reach out to our superintendents and say that our ratios are starting to get higher, and we will start to look at where the ratios might be lower in other parts of the district. Right now, it's because the numbers are so high, it's mostly increasing at multiple schools. So at that point, we will see what funding is available to put in an extra teacher, ESOL teacher, or language acquisition ed tech. We'll go through that funding process, post that position. So it takes a few weeks to post and interview, and if an available candidate is offered the position, typically 1 year only for the rest of the school year, to help support those higher numbers, then we'll hire them, onboard them, and bring them in. There are some limitations. We run up against space limitations and construction limitations, so that an additional teacher may not be an available classroom to put that extra teacher in. That's typically one that we run up against with several of the schools under construction. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. My other question is related to the intake. As Grace mentioned that when students complete the registration, they also know which bus to take and all the process. Is that include social work? Do we refer them to social work? And
Yes.
Yeah.
And also if there are special education needs, if that support is needed, so we coordinate also with special education. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Board Member Youssef. Board Member Russellbetter.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for all of the data you shared, and really helps with context of where we are over the many years of receiving students and how much things have changed. So my question is in relation to some of what Member Youssef just asked. I was just looking at the slides specifically of the McKinney-Vento count by school, and in a similar vein to Member Youssef's question, I just, looking at those numbers, I do get concerned about schools like Reiki and King and during the capacity to manage the needs of those students. I was just wondering, I know this is January and you probably just don't have the data, but would you guess that February, March, like that number of students is just continuing to grow from the 300, almost 400, over 400? Like, is that pattern continuing to?
It looks like that.
Yeah.
I think we have lower enrollment in February. I didn't have a chance to complete that. I think we only have 39 because we did not do intake for 1 week because that's school vacation week. And we also did 2 weeks of screening for pre-K. So really that's a few days only for intake that we did in February. So.
Okay. And Carlos started to kind of touch on this. So maybe since January, there's been some shifting, but I totally understood, Dr. Valenzuela, what you mentioned about the school start time, that of course, families that are in shelters, the bus, you have to consider if schools are starting at 7 something, but I just wondered, sort of future thinking if trying to balance out. And I don't know if some of the decision is also not only that, but staffing in those buildings, like do some schools not have the capacity with staff? I also just, besides the ESOL staff, wonder about social work capacity because, some of our buildings only have one. And, we know that those students have the needs of their basic, helping with their laundry and getting clothes and basic needs. So I just, noticing those numbers, which is so helpful. Like, I just wonder about future planning to be able to spread the students amongst our buildings. Just what thoughts you had about that.
Yeah, it's in the request for those things. And actually, we have a McKinney-Vento liaison that is just, housed at the district level. And so could support the students in terms of some of the case management and social work services. Actually, Priscilla, are you there? You want to add something to that? Priscilla is our McKinney-Vento liaison. You there? No?
I also just wanted to add to your question, Member Russell Better. The intake team does a pretty, a fabulous job of trying to coordinate this puzzle. And so we do enroll, like it'll be a case, for example, at Reiki, where there's a given grade level or a couple grade levels that may not be available because they're at kind of the classroom axis. So we still manage and enroll up to the classroom ratios that we talked about last week at the given grade levels. And so that becomes a puzzle because some grade levels may be available, others not. There may be siblings. So that's part of the challenge in trying to find. And we really have kind of maxed out the late start schools, Reiki, Row. And so we have been transitioning, obviously not ideal, but there has been capacity at Ocean and Longfellow. And historically, Longfellow is a place where we did invest a bit more resource to be able to take McKinney-Vento students. The pandemic and, a number of factors have kind of disrupted our ability to capitalize on that. But those are places where there is some classroom capacity and we're trying to direct students, but we're managing the challenge of kind of the arrival and start time as well. And so transportation becomes a piece too, given where they're housed and where we have routes. I mean, we know transportation is at capacity, right? So it's, really a coordination across multiple of those things to try and find places where we have seats, right, within our classroom ratios, and then the available supports. And Grace, I didn't know if you wanted to speak as well. So in addition to the support from the McKinney-Vento liaison, we have an additional social worker that provides support that, for students that's kind of housed centrally through this team, but also provide supports for a number of these students.
And we're going to be utilizing some of the money that we have right now, at least through September, for the social work support, case management specifically.
Okay, thank you. And does that social worker, Superintendent Townsend, go to where they do they go to the schools that the students are in?
Yes, to support students where they are.
Okay, so they're mobile, they're moving around depending on where students are. Okay, no, but that's so helpful. Superintendent, just regard what you said about, getting to the capacity and that. I mean, I know it's just flexibility, all the time, right? Like just having to shift what the need is, but that's just helpful to know that you're kind of, what makes sense transportation. And then when they're at capacity, you're kind of trying to problem solve again. But I totally get the transportation piece is really complex and the start time too. And all the pieces to manage, but thank you for helping me understand just kind of how you're making those decisions. Thanks.
Board Member Figdor and then Board Member Grant.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. My first is with respect to seeing such an increase in our intakes. Dr. Valenzuela, I'm wondering how your team has handled those, just recognizing how intensive the process is. And then my second question is for our co-superintendents, is just trying to get a sense of how you're grappling with the staffing needs in the FY24 budget, given these changes that we're seeing, so getting a sense of I'm not asking for you to present numbers tonight, but just how you're thinking about it, how you're thinking specifically about meeting the increased need with everything I'm coming away with is the expectation that we'll continue to have increased needs on top of what we've already been seeing. Thank you so much.
You want to do the first part, Grace, then I can answer.
We barely. There are days when we have teary staff members, because it's just really, we could not keep up. So, just over school vacation week, we received 60 students to register. So it is new students to add to the roster. And so it is the volume we have not seen. And so we're actually just posted. We have another admin assistant to support us with this, even just to arrange all of the scheduling, calling families to when they can make the appointment. And so we have a number of positions that we are using the money through September 30th for that and support us at intake.
And then just building on that, Grace mentioned that we have those short-term grant funds available, which the team is taking advantage of. But we will, when we present the budget, kind of synthesize the requests as it pertains to being responsive to the needs of the students that are newly arriving. There are multiple requests for ads in terms of intake and family community specialist team. And then as per what Carlos has always shared, we have the methodology. So now we'll roll those numbers into that spreadsheet to show you how many additional FTE in terms of ESOL teachers that would indicate we need. And then I just want to just say transparently, what's challenging is what you're hearing about how this works is that we're having students join us on an ongoing basis. So with the methodology that Carlos uses, that's a point in time. So we're trying to be mindful of, okay, when we're presenting the budget and locking that in, who are the students we have? But that's an evolving number. And so that's just for you all to understand, tricky to manage in terms of the resource side of it.
And I just want to add that, talking about point in time, note that the EPS formula is based on the enrollment of October 1st. So that doesn't count, the additional kids who came after that, which is 284 up to January. So I just want to say that there is that gap as well.
Thank you. Board Member Grant?
That actually perfectly anticipates my question, because I was under the impression that the student head count happens twice a year. Isn't there an April count
Not pertaining
For the
to formula.
EPS formula.
for this current formula? But wouldn't that play into the next one, the next year's? No? Okay. So then, I guess only somewhat related. Do we have a sense at this point of how many? I mean, we have a roster of, it sounds like almost 700 new arrivals during the year. How many are retained? Like, do we know, like, from the cohort that was in September, how many are here now? Or was that already asked? I'm sorry.
I think that's what Vice Chair Bondo was asking.
Sorry
if we
if I
can follow up on.
misunderstood. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think the intention is to circle back and get that data.
No, yeah, I think I just misheard her question.
No, that's okay.
Thank you.
Board Member Opperman, did you have a question?
I have a couple. One is a comment and a question or a view. Research has shown that smaller class sizes in general are important for individuals, particularly individuals who are marginalized. And when we're talking about adding and having such a number of individuals who are having a difficulty understanding the teacher, I would wonder if there's any particular student-teacher ratio of regular teachers, because we hear what is correct for in general, but how does this fit in? Are we actually overloading classrooms per se? That would be my first question. I don't know if there's data on that.
We're actually not over. I think Mr. Townsend said that in terms of the decision point where we place students is based on our required class size for particular grades. So we look at that.
Yes, but if you're talking about a class size for a particular grade and then you adjust for the fact that it may not be a standard
I see what you're
English class setup, if there's any data for saying, what particular, you probably don't have it now, but that would be something that would be very interesting to know.
Yeah. And we had, I know class sizes come up before, so we do have a next step to just pull some of that research around elementary class sizes.
It'd be great to hear that.
Yeah.
My other question, actually jumping from elementary up to high school and paths and all, and the CAL issue in visiting schools, particularly visiting paths where there is some very specific language, maybe not that's involved, and ESOL teachers don't translate. So how does one help those students access that language in very highly technical situations?
So part of it is helping the paths teachers to be aware and be cognizant of the complexity of the language for their area of expertise, and to give them strategies to scaffold and support language instruction there. Part of it is through home language interpreting when possible. And a couple of years ago, we did take a look at the language complexity of various programs and have maybe, kind of identified 2 or 3 levels of difficulty. So take something like auto repair, or the CNA program has some very technical language, whereas some of the other courses have less technical language. So being aware of those different levels. Obviously, I've been working closely with Mr. Stilfen, the director, and trying to have as many points of entry for students, understanding that type of experiential learning is like it's a really rich place to learn English, and I'm super excited about his level of excitement, and the staff at Paths willingness to participate and engage in that. So it's a work in progress.
All right. Thank you, Board Member Opperman. Any other questions from the board? Board Member Youssef?
Yeah, one last very quick question. So I worked with students, 2 students who are about to graduate from high school, but they are not able to read or write. That kind of situation, what I know you have mentioned, the complexity comes when writing and reading, but they may be very fluent in speaking and understanding. What do we have in place for that kind of support where we know they will end up difficult, going to?
So typically the profile of the student that you're describing may not only have difficulty in reading and writing in English, but perhaps in their home language as well. So at the high school level, we're really paying attention to the students who require literacy and numeracy support through SLIFE services, so students with limited or interrupted formal education. So there are various teachers and staff and curriculum that is supporting that level of student. We're also working, we have an ESOL specialist who is half-time at Portland Adult Ed, half-time supporting our secondary programs. And we are in constant communication through her with guidance and with our ESOL teachers and with students directly to have them be aware of what their options are post-secondary. To sometimes they age out. In most cases, they do. And so what are their options in Portland Adult Ed, at SMCC, and other areas to continue to develop their English literacy?
And I was just going to add the resource point to that, since board members have had questions about that. So that transitions coordinator position, the 0.5 that's doing what Carlos described, is both direct service to students in terms of that support, but also looking at our systems and structures as a kind of at a coordination level. So how are we creating systems and pathways for students? I know today you all were meeting about some need for policy change around credit. And that position is 0.25 funded by bar money that's going away. So that would leave only 0.25 right now that we have funded. And there has been a request to expand that another 0.5. So when we pull together all the requests for you to see, just want to bring some transparency into the fact that that's an ad that's been requested by the team. And there's some loss of grant funds. So it would also show up as an ad just to keep what we have.
Thank you so much. I recognize the complexity of that, and it's not an easy job. Thank you so much for explaining.
Thank you.
I just want to add that, this is something that we missed talking about in terms of, because Carlos mentioned the profile of English learners. So they're not one and the same. Just want to make sure that's highlighted, that. And students without literacy in their first language and arriving at the high school level is really a challenge for transition. It's a challenge of level of support that they need to acquire the language. Academic language is a big one. Research shows that the optimal age for student arrival to and learning in another language is at 5th to 6th grade, considering that they have literacy in their first language all the way through. Because what happens right now, they arrive with us at grades 1, grade 2. We're teaching them literacy in a language that they do not speak yet. So just, think about the complexity of that. So that's different. So whereas that 5th grader or 6th grader with literacy in the language, that's only transferring the literacy that they already have. And they are only in the academic language that they've already gotten if they had full schooling, continuous schooling. So I just it's very complicated.
I've got Board Member Biliu.
Thank you. To kind of piggyback off of that, knowing that it is complex and that they aren't one student or one identity, why is the approach one approach? Why isn't there multiple approaches to create resources that would address those different those different ways of learning, especially for those who are coming at a later time?
Yeah. I mean, Member Billy, are you referring to how we have a methodology for figuring out ratios and things like that? That's just sort of the same across the board, and why we do it that way?
Sorry, can you reframe that?
Oh, so in terms of your question, are you asking about how we figure out how much staff we need based on ratios? Yeah. Is that where you're coming from? Okay.
Yeah, like staff that would be doing different work or positioning than the regular like ELL or regular English language learner teachers.
Yeah, I mean, Carlos, you should join me in this, but I think it's a great question. I think a couple things I would say, and then you can add on to it, Carlos. The first is that your question is something we've also asked that other people have asked us, because with special education, when we're figuring out the resources, right? So that's one thing that's different. And as far as differentiated from then figuring out the student in front of us, who are they? What are their strengths? What are their gifts? What are their needs? But in trying to plan the resources, in special education, we look at the disability and then we create a weighted formula that understands typical differences and needs, and then that factors in. Whereas we don't have that with our methodology for ESOL staffing. But we do actually at one level, which is we factor differently for IELD students as compared to CAL. So that's the one kind of way that we think of that differentiation. But then our data gives visibility into a bunch of other factors if they are duly identified with in special education, McKinney-Vento, et cetera. And that is more information in front of us for making judgment calls when staffing is kind of close. But I think your question is something, people have asked and we've asked ourselves, do we need to take that kind of further in terms of how we bring those other elements into how we resource for the students. And then there are also positions and times in our budget where we've added specific program needs for the students and for the population. So the position I mentioned, the transitions coordinator that Carlos was speaking to, that's a specific role we've talked about and invested in that's outside of the formula. We've made some SLIFE positions for SLIFE programming that are specific and dedicated to that particular programming. So there are some resources outside of the straight ratios that have been invested in terms of specific and unique programming that we're trying to provide.
And maybe another example might be the investment in Portuguese world language to help students increase literacy in their most dominant language of literacy. And the language acquisition ed techs are resources that our students have access to process and understand content and oftentimes interpret and understand English and develop their English. So that those are in addition to maybe some of the investments in SLIFE programming or SLIFE services. That's another area that where there's a bit of a critical mass among our ESOL teachers and maybe even some of our administrators and gen ed teachers to more fully understand what are some instructional approaches that and curricular resources that will help us support the students who are in front of us currently. So the picture's changing of who's approaching. So we're often a couple of steps behind, but we're motivated to know and learn more. And I'm encouraged by the level of curiosity and cultural humility by our staff to support our students.
Thank you. And then my other question is, what you might not be able to tell me this now, but how many of the current positions are occupied by, or like what is the demographic of the current positions and who occupies them? And what does representation look like in that space? Because as people, obviously, as like people who have dual identity or speak multiple languages, if there is proper representation in these positions, a lot of those setbacks, especially with language, might be able to be filled. So I'm wondering, one, what is the demographic, and two, what is the intentionality about having those positions being represented so that resources can be more useful?
I'll get back to you on the percentage of staff, but in general, that's something that we're always looking for in hiring our ESOL teachers is knowledge of other languages, from preferably cultural and linguistic background of our students. We have been hiring more staff of color, I think, in our ESOL staff over the last few years. Let me reiterate, I guess, for just for clarification, I meant intentionality, like how, and maybe this is more of like a hiring question, but like, what is the intentionality of like going to spaces to retain those people instead of like just waiting for them to apply?
Mm-hmm. I think we should, I think it is a question that comes with our HR team. So I think let's follow up on that, but I'm hearing you in terms of how are we proactive, like what's our intention as far as our goal and aspiration for the diversity of the staff, and then what's our actual recruitment strategy in terms of finding people proactively to fill the seats. And I do think we can speak to that, Member Bilyeu. So maybe we can come back with the data and then bring in Barrett and folks from HR to talk collaboratively about some of the moves we're making. And Julia Hazel, too, who's the director of BIPOC Leadership Pathways, is focused on thinking about both who's coming in for all positions, but also ed techs, and then creating really deliberate pathways for people in ed tech positions into teacher positions, which is broad, but also would for sure pertain to ESOL teachers and staff.
Yeah, I mean, I only say that because I think if we were intentional in making sure those positions were occupied by people who could represent those languages or identities, then they could be a resource in helping folks excel in their English language learning more, or be a resource in other ways. Because when I was in ELL, we had multiple teachers of color that were helpful in like many different ways, obviously, as anybody that is coming from a different country would need, or like resources that they would need. My other question is, I guess it could be in the same grain in terms of like what are the trainings required for somebody to be an ELL teacher, and like what would be needed for a mainstream teacher to also like have those requirements?
So that is delineated by the Maine Department of Education for the 660 endorsement. Typically, it's 5 courses around cultural and linguistic diversity, linguistics of the aspects of the English language. Help me out with some of those courses. Teaching methodology, assessment.
Thank you. That's fine. That was a good list. I just have one more question, and this is more specific to when these students are coming here, they don't have really a good grasp of like the social constructs or the reality of what they would be living in. And I'm wondering, on top of those trainings, what the district is doing to equip those teachers with like the understanding of equity and the prioritizing of inclusion, but also like uprooting white supremacy and creating space to discuss that in these classrooms, so that or creating the resource to be able to discuss that part of their assimilation or that part of their experience, especially if they're going to be experiencing it at school. Just some clarification. So yeah, if the multilingual department has like resources to help teachers like be supportive on that level to support students on the ground with like, you know, assimilating racism or some things that might just be hard for them to grasp because they're coming from a whole different culture.
On one level, the Department of Language Development has our language acquisition ed techs, who are often of the same cultural and linguistic background as the students. So they are a resource to help. And in fact, that's their primary role, is to help students understand and transition into an American school system. So that's one sort of at the classroom level resource. The Multilingual Center and the Family Community Engagement Specialists are working with families, working with staff, with schools in general to be that cultural bridge and ensure that schools are understanding what the family and students are experiencing, or what they may have experienced in their home countries or on their journey here. And they are also sharing with families what aspects of the American school system that will help families understand and hopefully adjust in different ways. So it's two-way adjustment, right? Schools adjusting to the students in front of us, and families adjusting to a new reality here.
And
staff development is an important piece of all this, and is required and asked for, and really it seems like that's a high demand to have that level of professional development.
Yeah, and I was that was what I was going to kind of add, was there's part of what I heard in Member Bilia's question, and then this might just be my hearing it, but it's all staff, right? How is everybody in the building growing their awareness and humility and ability to help students process that transition? So I think there are, when we do new teacher orientation, Grace's team comes and talks about the different countries that students are coming from and some context. And I know that people love that professional development. But I also just want to be honest that I think, and Barrett's here listening too, in terms of a collaboration between our diversity, equity, and belonging team and language development and multilingual, that we could get stronger and better at specifically providing professional development for classroom teachers about that, about the transition and what happens in assimilation and those components as well. So I appreciate the question, because I do think there's room for growth and improvement in our staff development efforts on that front as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's reassuring. And yeah, I just think it's such an important part in their search for success and better education. But I think it's really important to really intersectionalize some of those professional development and ensure that they're incorporating some of the different parts. Even special ed, I'm sure could utilize some of that inclusivity, or some of that recognition in that space. I think I just definitely want to emphasize that it's a hard space to be, and when the school system is not aware of your own experience and your own displacement as a student, it's hard for you to succeed or find your space in a structure like that. So I just want to emphasize that and emphasize the training to support that.
Thank you, Board Member Bilio. And one last question. Are these the vitalist questions that we must ask tonight? Yes. Okay. Board Member Opperman first, and then Vice Chair Bondo.
I want to bring up Portland Adult Ed. I don't know what kind of collaboration you do with coordination with them, but listening to Board Member Bilio's question about alternative ways of looking at things, where you might have parents and students working together to learn, or the staffs being shared as you started to do. I don't know if there's any trend toward that, but that's a huge ELL situation. That's my question.
Thank you.
Any trend in that direction?
I think so. We've recruited teachers from or students who are students who at Portland Adult Ed to become teachers or language acquisition ed techs. So we see that as a resource. We're also working with our transition specialists, which we mentioned earlier, to have our students who are aging out to land and transition into Portland Adult Ed, if that's something that they see as an option. We have also used some teachers at Adult Ed to help lead some professional learning communities or some professional development with our various schools. So it's and we borrow teachers from each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Bondo.
think those questions may be some follow-up question answer. So I'm coming back to that question. Then, Member Bill, you just mentioned about the student who just arrived with low literacy skills, and we have to boost from the literacy and the language together. So that's exactly why I came back to raising my question about the numbers on the dual ID and some other language issues, because about the learning strategy in the classroom. So I try to imagine myself in the mainstream classroom, a teacher who has about 10 students in that position with low literacy, without enough resources or allocation in that specific classes. So I see the way those students can hold the learning, the general learning in the classroom. So I just want to look at what Superintendent Melia just mentioned about methodology, but I just want to see if we can have a figure how many we have of those students in our district, and what kind of resource being allocated on those specific classes to support teachers. That's why I know it may be a lot, but I think something, if we want to think about investment in the future, I think we need to have those foundations to figure out if we're really allocating the right resource in the classroom for those specific teachers, because I think is a large need to try to move those students from the literacy skill and the language combining together for better success.
I think one thing that we've been moving towards over the last year and a half, as we've received more IELD students who require literacy and numeracy support, especially at the high school level, maybe at the middle school level and upper elementary level. We're seeing that more and more students have some degree of literacy need in their primary language and applying it to English. So we're developing the instructional strategies and some curriculum supports for our ESOL teachers and also for our general education teachers. So I think we're moving away from sort of the identification of a student as a SLIFE student, and an understanding that many of our intensive English language development students also have some literacy and numeracy needs that we're trying to support.
All right. Okay. I can send some question later on, maybe. And just for my last one, I'm so sorry. I just want to know for the dual ID. I know that we have a higher coordinator to try to identify if those students really need a language support only or a special education. The number that we have here, did we already coordinate that, or they're still in process?
The numbers that you have in front of you are multilingual learners with IEPs. So they've gone through the referral process, and they have specially designed instruction.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. I'm done, Chair.
All right, thank you, Vice Chair Bondo. I just would like to express some gratitude for both of you for all the information that you presented, and for the intentionality and care and deep love that you give every student who walks through the Multilingual Center. It's palpable when you go and visit. So thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, co-superintendents, whenever you're ready.
We're ready. So great. So this is a workshop to just bring some more transparency and understanding into our district-wide teams. So our goals are really, like I said, to build transparency and understanding. So we're going to set a little bit of context for you all in terms of kind of conceptually how we think about district teams. And then we'll step you through some departmental overviews where we'll give a general sense of the scope of responsibility within the department, which of course is very impossible to capture in a slide, but gives you kind of the big categories of responsibility. as well as the number of FTEs that are allocated per each department. And then we'll take some questions at the end. I will say that we're going department by department, and I think for efficiency's sake, it's going to make the most sense to hold all questions till the end. That's okay. All right, move us forward. So some context. So some historical context. So, and this is kind of trying to make, expose the architecture, if you will, behind how we think about this. So when we're looking at the district teams, and I'll just say that I'm calling us district-wide teams, not central office. Central office is a building. These are teams that work across all of our schools and across our entire organization. So we think about them as district-wide teams or serving all schools. So when we launched the Portland Promise, we were trying to be really intentional about aligning the structure of our organization to the strategy. And at that time, what we had as far as our staffing, it was not lined up in a kind of logical and coherent way. So just in terms of setting some context, a lot of board members are new. There were a lot of deliberate moves at the launch of the Promise to figure that out. And some highlights that I have up here are some early restructuring, which did include pretty significant cuts to, here I am using central office, the district-wide teams that are housed at central office. So we cut in FY19 just under $1 million from those departments. And I just think in the context of where we are today, talking about the operational needs that we have, that's just, important context. And of course, that wasn't what we wanted to do. That was just, being forced with really hard decisions and budget constraints. And then we also, while we cut, we did some reallocation. And so an example might be that we didn't have a curriculum department or a mental and behavioral health department at all. We had no positions for mental and behavioral health looking at our strategy district-wide. So we started to try to create some small teams that are looking at the coordination and cohesion of that body of work across all of our grade spans in schools. At that time, we also had a lot of very deliberate and direct conversation as a leadership and administration team around moving toward advancing a district-wide strategy. So we were moving from a collection of schools, who are all kind of doing their own thing. So from a student's perspective, really your experience was, well, it depends on the school I go to and the teacher I get, to trying to create some common, consistent, guaranteed experiences that are tied to each other, both what came before and what comes after. So examples that sort of help show where we were at that point are, we only had $75,000 total in the district budget for curriculum, pre-K through 12, all content areas. So I was trying to do math. That was like about $10 per kid, right? At the time, little just.
Could you say that again in the microphone?
About $10, a little bit more. And Gail, you can text me on my watch if I got that wrong. For all grade levels, all content areas. So very minimal investment there. But also we didn't have a strategy looking at that. And, as we said, we had at the time, we talked about the loose to tight continuum. So do we want to have totally autonomous schools or really tight district strategy? And people felt like we wanted to be in the middle where we had aligned goals and priorities and some common instructional vision and tools, but not have it be super tight at the district level. But to manage that kind of middle of the road continuum requires, pretty significant coordination. Another highlight is just in terms of our equity work that we've been doing. I think it's super important that we've been acknowledging that this is, we aren't going to get to where we need to go through, individual action. That needs to happen, and we need to do systems level change, right? This system was designed to get the results it gets. And so if we want to get different outcomes, we have to look bigger picture systems wide. And so that again requires people looking at the full picture in the long term. And an example there, when we started, 97% of our educators, our teachers were white, whereas about half of our students were BIPOC. And so to try to move, and, remember Bailey brought this up, what's your intentionality? What's your recruitment strategy? So to move that requires people looking at this broader recruitment strategy versus each individual principal having to figure out on their own, how am I going to create a recruitment strategy to bring more diverse people into the system. And then one other point of context to point out is we did seek external input on right sizing departments. Some of it was proactive for a little further back. Some has been responsive with the Spinglass report. So later on, we'll highlight how our departments compare to what we've been told would be appropriate for our size. And, the headline is going to be that they think we should have more staff than we have. Okay. And then before we talk specific departments, because it's impossible to capture on these slides what all these departments are doing, we wanted to highlight some of the core responsibilities that are true for all departments, and then you apply within whatever is their domain. And these, at first I had titled this value proposition, which sounded very jargony, but it is, what's the value add? Like, what are you, by having people who are looking across schools, what are you getting out of that? And if you aren't investing in that kind of structure, what do you lose, essentially? So some of what we wanted to highlight here is first coherence, right? So these teams that are looking across the schools have the bird's eye view, are connecting dots, are spotting and uplifting promising practices among schools and educators, and then very much centering that student experience and looking at, okay, what, if a student's coming from pre-K here and going to this elementary school in this middle, what does that experience look like? And so kind of a quick illustrative example is, the vertical teams. We've talked about these before. So we didn't have an instructional vision at the system level previously. So we've been able to bring together teachers from across all schools to create a kind of research-based instructional vision that's now driving investments, it's driving professional development, and that's leading toward more of that coherent experience. An example, when we did science vertical teams, we took and some of you might have heard me joke about this before, but we were trying to find out what people were teaching, and plate tectonics comes up because I think, some people, I think 6 different times we were teaching about plate tectonics, which hopefully they really mastered that. But, because there wasn't that sort of coherent, that strong look at the coherence. Or, we've had many students come and tell us through different student listening sessions, like, how come my friend learned this thing and I never learned that at all? That comes up in social studies topics a lot. So that's the coherence point. The next is coordination. And so I said that with that sort of tight to loose continuum, but what these teams are doing is pulling people together to facilitate coordination, collaboration across schools and teachers. So this is really key for teacher voice. Somebody has to do the planning of, okay, what's the structure? Who are we getting? Is it going to be paid? Are we going to do salary contractors? When's the time? Where's the place? What's the agenda? Who's facilitating? So there's just a lot there that's helping us bring people together to collaborate, to lift up voice, to plan professional development, coordinating community partners. This is coming up a lot with our curriculum where, GMRI or whatever is the partner of the Audubon, we're able to work with that group to integrate meaningful experiences across the curriculum so that that the Audubon folks aren't trying to talk to a person at every single school and figure out something different. So that coordination piece is big. Compliance. This is something that we look at in the district teams. So there's a lot of compliance related activity that we are responsible for in terms of state and federal rules, staying abreast of policy changes and requirements, monitoring, tracking. So that's a really big body of work that's largely invisible to people in the system. And so it's like only visible when we don't do it and we don't do it well. And so that's hard to sort of sum up how much is there, but there's quite a body of work pertaining to compliance. Resource management, obviously we're in the budget system now, so it's really that bird's eye view that's helping us look at how we're allocating resources. We were just talking about the midstream needs for new arrival students, and so people that understand the different federal grants, other grants, what we have in local. So really being able to manage resources that also gets at, like when I mentioned the curriculum, when we didn't have anyone people looking at that, we aren't investing, and we end up with no curriculum materials except for what schools are trying to scrape together, or teachers are scraping together on their own. Efficiencies for schools. So this is like the economies of scale. So this takes work off schools' plates. Again, invisible, right? Unless you take it away and then the work comes back to people. But there are a bunch of things that happen, activity that happens in some of these district-wide teams that somebody has to do. So I think a good example is like our technology integration coordinator. So just a small thing is, if we are using a tech tool, we have to, first, there's a whole bunch of things to vet for data privacy. So it's like a big thing. And prior to having that, we had tools out there, people using things that were not compliant with data privacy laws. There's rostering, there's licensing, there's managing all that. So all that kind of stuff, it's not like the stuff you kind of grab onto and is as maybe exciting to talk about, but a lot of that happens, and there's some economies of scale by having people who are looking at that, monitoring it, that expert in that. And then finally, the innovation point and continuous improvement. So it's important, we think, to have an organization where there are some people who are not just doing daily implementation, whose job it is to not have to be every single day doing the implementation work, but thinking up and forward in terms of what's happening, what are we learning, what's the research saying, and so planning forward. So that's, not a ton of capacity realistically, because the way we're staffed, everybody's executing on a lot of nitty-gritty work daily, but still our intention is that there's that in some of these district-wide teams as well. So we'll just quickly run you through. We decided that Aaron and I will do this rather than having the different cabinet members, because we figured that would probably be more efficient. So we'll go pretty at a pretty quick clip, hopefully. And you can bug me and I'll bug you if we're not being that way. But we do have the team here to answer other questions if Aaron or I can't answer them. So this just gives you the organizational chart, which is probably easier if you're looking on your screen. And so we're going to talk to those boxes that are up there, but just wanted to kind of frame it up for those of you who like to see the big picture before getting into some of the details. Great. So starting with the academic departments. So these are organized into core instruction and support. So our curriculum and instruction department and our mental health department, mental and behavioral health department, then supplemental services, so language development, special ed, and Title I. Special ed's italicized because we aren't going to get into that, because that gets into its own sort of whole other complex conversation that we want to have with you all, that's sort of less about district teams and more sort of the whole structure of special ed. And then we have some grade specific supports that are looking district wide at the pre-K and high school level. So first is curriculum instruction and assessment. So I won't read all the bullets here in terms of what's up here, but this is the department that's looking at the coherent academic experience, working to make sure we have that baseline guaranteed curriculum for all students. Working on those high quality instructional materials and tools so that teachers are, I think of it as respecting teachers as professionals, with making sure that they have high quality research-based tools at their disposal. This team's looking at support for educators in terms of professional development, collaborative structures, coaching. They're coordinating partners to augment and expand our programmatic offerings. They're sort of doing that research and evaluation in terms of continuous improvement, or what are we seeing with outcomes? How are we adjusting? And so they are, those are some highlights from those bullets. One thing that I meant to mention up previously when I was talking about resource management, did I even talk about resource management? I did, is the fact that, and I'll say it when I'm on this slide with this team, because a lot of this team does this work, is managing grant money. So by having some of these people, we're able to bring in money that supplements the local budget, because there are people who are applying for, managing, monitoring, reporting on grants. So I know, at least within the academic team, Gail had let me know that this year the team is involved in either applying for, managing, or overseeing, I think, a little over $8 million in grants. So there is sort of this additive opportunity by having people who are kind of doing that body of work. So as far as curriculum and instruction, so this team's looking at pre-K through 12, all content areas. And so we have 2 non-rep staff doing that. And then we have right now 4 teachers who are in full release. So 1 teacher who's looking at literacy, 1 person who's looking at science, and then 1 person who's doing social studies, Wabanaki studies, and then experiential learning. I'm noting there on the bottom, there are 2 shared coaches at the secondary level that come in our sort of, we consider part of the team, but we don't bake those school coaches into the central office or the district team. So that's why I want to bring visibility, but that's more like how we have a literacy or math coach in an elementary building. And so of that team, 4.6 people are locally funded. And so the rest is covered through grants. And later on, when we talk about requests coming in, the literacy teacher leader is an example of somebody who's covered with grants that are going away. So if we were to have still just 1 person looking at literacy pre-K through 12, that would require an add to the budget at this point. So next is our mental and behavioral health department. So this team is responsible, again, at the systems level for our strategy, for our resources, for coordination, for coherence, et cetera, around the topics of social emotional learning, our PBIS system and restorative practices. I know there's been a lot of conversation about mental health and a lot of conversation about discipline. And so really we're kind of using these systems and structures. And so how are we understanding, diagnosing where people are at, action planning with them, supporting them, following through. So they're doing that work. They oversee the social work department, work with the middle and elementary counselors. They're looking at the trauma-informed practices, also liaising with behavioral health community partners. And then they have a bunch of protocols that they're responsible for, some of which you can see up there on the slide. So that team who's supporting pre-K through 12, all things mental and behavioral health as it pertains to that coordination, cohesion, et cetera, is 2 people. And 0.6 is locally funded. Language development, you're very familiar with Carlos. So I'm not going to kind of go too deep into this. I just want to point out that in addition to all of what's here that we've been talking about in terms of the LAU plan and ESOL and ILD and SLIFE programming and summer and all of that, what's also baked into language development is our sealed biliteracy work, our immersion work, our world language supports. And that has, everything ranging from the strategic resource management that we just talked about to the compliance, to the training that we're talking about that we need. And then some of those details, those invisible details like immersion, making sure teachers have visa, right? Did Carlos leave? Like there's a huge, it's an unbelievable amount of work to get teachers visas and home housing and all of that. So all of that stuff lives in there. That's a total of 3 people. So 2 non-rep and the equivalent of 1 teacher. So 2 different 0.5 teachers, 1.5 for world language and 1.5 that transitions coordinator we were talking about with the Portland Adult Ed high school level. And of those 3, 2.5 are locally funded. And then we have our ESSA grants Title I. And so this is I'm sure Gail's listening because she listens to all of our board meetings, but if you were to talk about all that goes into this function department, we'd be here very late. So broadly speaking, lots of compliance reporting, but there's also strategic work in terms of these funds are additive and intended to support, especially the Title I students from low-income backgrounds. And so there's the strategy component of it as well. There's reporting, there's proposing plans, et cetera. So all of that is in that department of 1. And of that department of 1, 0.1 of that FTE is in our local budget. And then finally here within the academics is pre-K and high school. So these grade span specific supports. So, oh boy, gotta get my reading glasses. to remind myself. So for pre-K, this is our public pre-K program. We've talked about pre-K with you all. So this is the citywide program, which includes community partners like Catherine de Moro, YFO, et cetera, plus all of the school-based classrooms. And so they're responsible for the citywide universal access to pre-K vision and strategy, the partner coordination, the lottery management, enrollment, hiring, onboarding, subbing coordination. So this is something where, because we have teachers in partner programs on our contract, our district-wide director is responsible for the hiring, onboarding, training, and evaluation of those educators. So they're doing like that direct work like a principal does. It's curriculum assessment, it's PD, it's Chapter 124 compliance, it's CDS coordination. So we're bringing in CDS. So all of those components, and that's 2 FTE that are locally funded. And then finally, the high school work is like what we're taking up around high school vision work, the design team, the grade span teams, the transitions work, the credit recovery, et cetera. So that's the position, the secondary academic access and outcomes coordinator, Pamela. And so that's a 1.0 FTE, none of which is currently funded locally. Okay. And then I'll talk about a few other places, and then Erin will pop up here. So we have the data team. So there's the data part that you might imagine when we come up here. We have these people and talk through some of our outcomes in terms of our data. They also are doing all of our state and federal reporting. So like, I think we have like a bullying report, for example. I mean, there's just a huge amount of these kinds of compliance related reports, and that they're producing all of that. They're managing the Google Suite and other systems around related to student information. And device security. This is the group that does all of our FOIA requests, which are plentiful. So when somebody asks for a FOIA, which happens very frequently, that's something I think we knew about, but then being in this position, we're like, wow, they're pulling all those emails and working with our lawyers. So that's 4 people. And currently, just for folks' awareness, 2 of those are vacant. Next is the diversity, equity, and belonging team. I know that some folks have had some confusion and questions about this because we used to have Barrett's position as the director of DEI, and then we made a little bit of a shift strategically to create this diversity, equity, and belonging team. And so we didn't replace that director position. We just added to Barrett's plate and then put some people under him on that team, essentially. And so this is where we plan and facilitate the new employee training and orientation. So all of the stuff we do for new teachers, new teacher mentoring, managing our professional learning-based salary system, our courses, evaluation, teacher evaluation, staff evaluation. This is where the work we're trying to do around BIPOC leadership pathways lives, the recruitment and strategy that people have been asking about tonight. And then this department also includes some student-facing work, so the Title IX, the student harassment, discrimination, complaint work, and then all of our labor and employee relations lives within this function as well. And so that's 5.5 FTE, all of which are currently locally funded. And then Erin's going to talk about the rest.
Great. Good evening. Try and move through here the last few of our awesome district-wide teams. So following from, the kind of strategic work that Malia was talking about that the diversity, equity, and belonging team holds, we have our HR operations team. So that was part of the shift this year in terms of restructuring on the operations side, so we can ensure that we're really tending to both of those things, because often operations can overwhelm strategy. So we wanted to ensure we had investments in both, particularly given the staffing challenges, that we've experienced kind of post-pandemic. So the HR operations team does all that nitty-gritty work. Our director, Chris St. Louis, is here with us tonight. So they're the ones doing the hiring, processing the paperwork, getting people on board, doing some of the posting, moving them through the process, all the background check, setting them up, then doing the compensation analysis to kind of get them set up and ready to go. The benefits lives within that, and all the kind of credentials and certification work as well in terms of confirming that. So, of course, that reaches across all schools and departments, they serve. We have 7 FTE there, which includes, the reception up front, and 6 of those are currently locally funded. Moving forward, you heard, quite a bit from Grace and tonight about the multilingual and intake team. So won't go deep here, but doing all the work that we just spent a lot of time talking about is what's held there. So, that team currently has 17.95 FTE. So as you saw in a lot of those parent community specialist positions, a lot of kind of part-time and additional staffing. Right now, just a little bit more than 14 of those are locally funded. So I think one thing that didn't get highlighted in that conversation that as well falls within the scope of this team, because we really focused on the, family community specialists and the intake team, but this also includes work around broader kind of parent outreach and engagement. So all of our Parent U events, as well as, community partnerships in the youth development. So we heard from the incredible Make It Happen team and some of those students. And so they're provided kind of support through the multilingual and intake office. Additionally, also under Grace's umbrella, Dr. Valenzuela is our communications team. So kind of small but mighty team. So they're responsible for all of our kind of public presence, both internal and external communications, all of our newsletters, updates, website, all social media, etc. So, and they provide supports directly to schools as well to be able to help them with their communications. So that team is currently 2.9 with only 2.1 of them locally funded. So then moving into some of the additional operations teams, our finance department. So this includes both kind of the budget side of the house as well as our financial kind of accounting side of the house. So that was, again, as a reminder, and you can see it in the org chart, that was part of the restructuring in response to the audit last year to be able to have greater focus in those and not have those responsibilities spread so broadly within that team. So they're responsible for all of the money stuff. So I think, what they do, budget development and management, obviously we'll be spending a lot of time with Miranda over the next few weeks. But the grants management, accounting, payroll sits here, purchasing, everything kind of going in and coming out. So we currently have 10 FTE serving in that department, and 9 of them are currently funded locally. IT, so the other side of kind of the data house, so they are responsible for the many thousands of devices that we have, so we now are a 1-to-1 district for all students and staff, and that work lives with these folks. They manage and support all of the network infrastructure for us, the district data center, a lot of our cybersecurity work, and provide that direct technical support for staff. So currently we have 8 FTE within that department, all of whom are locally funded. So that's the end of the breeze through the district-wide teams. I see our public commenter, George, there. We do have, attached to board docs here, a recent update to the staff navigator that should reflect, these individuals that we're talking about, these numbers of FTE, like who they actually are, what their phone numbers are, further bullets about their specific responsibilities. And it should be updated in terms of current vacant positions and so forth. So you can go there for additional reference. But to what Malia spoke about, we've had the opportunity to get some input around external staffing. So during the onset of the pandemic, we got input from an external group around our IT and data teams. And so their report as well is attached to board docs. And they recommended at that time an increase of 7 FTE. to be able to serve for the number of devices and the number of students and staff that we have in our organization, an increase of 7 FTE. We have since that time added 1. So we've chipped away at that number. So now from what their recommendation was, we're still nominally short 6 FTE, with a number of those kind of focused on, the kind of technicians that right now cover, 4 to 5 schools or departments. And so looking to reduce those ratios to provide greater supports. So when students' Chromebooks break, there's somebody available to. Sounds like I'm striking a nerve over here with our student representatives. Sorry, jumping ahead before I got to the others. So obviously we've recently gotten input, from the Spin Glass report, and them referencing some industry standard data. So in their report, they had a recommendation of an increase of an additional FTE for the payroll team specifically, right? That's currently 3 FTE, a manager and 2 specialists. They recommended the addition of an additional specialist. And then broadly in terms of HR, there was a recommendation, kind of the industry standard for an organization our size is kind of 1.03 for every 100 staff members. So together, combined with both our HR operations team and the diversity, equity, and belonging team, we have about 12.5 FTE. So that would reflect, based on having roughly 2,000 individuals employed here, potentially an increase of up to 7.5 FTE, right, to be able to provide the level of service and support from an HR perspective. And then lastly, this wasn't so much an external staffing, formal staffing recommendation, but coming out of the single audit and in concert with the city, in terms of being able to address some of the findings there. There were a recommendation of a couple additional FTEs to improve our controls and tracking around that. So those were just the recommendations coming to us about how we might address some of the things on kind of the operational side. Here, definitely won't read all this. This is what we'll be engaging with over the next few weeks significantly. So this kind of reflects all of the different kind of FTE proposals, staffing ads, to be able to address many of these issues and kind of deficits that we've seen. So reflects the things we talked about in relationship to the responding to our new arrivals and the supports and intake and staffing needed to address that, as well as some of the operational issues, and a broad range of kind of needs to be able to advance. So certainly this is a long list. Many of these have been grant funded. And so that's obviously part of our ongoing strategy here. But we know that, the major chunk of grant funding that we have is just going to be available for 1 year more. So some challenging conversations ahead about how to make space for what's most essential, and to be able to continue to prioritize, the student and family experience, right? And ensure we have the right resources. So, we've been engaging as a leadership team over the past couple of weeks, and look forward to the presentation of our budget next week as we start to assert some recommendations, about what we advance from this list and, how we will make that work from a budget and strategy perspective. So that's it. We're happy to take any questions as it relates to, any of this, but wanted before we jumped into budget season to have this context.
All right, I'll open it up to questions. Yes, Vice Chair Bonda.
Thank you for the presentation. That's the way to end the meeting. It's just a big headache.
You remember Bondo.
Right. So I have some clarifications here on the when I see the curriculum and that's a curriculum instruction.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we have the vertical team. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
And then those are teachers, right? So we bring them as a teacher. Are they still teaching, or we just pull them out from the mainstream learning and they just become to the vertical team as a member?
So that team has the 2 non-rep folks and then 4 teacher leaders, and they are on full release. Mm-hmm. And so the vertical teams is one of many things they're doing. But they are not teaching. They're fully released. We call it fully released, meaning they don't have a class of students. So like Fiona Hopper is one of those 4. She's our social studies teacher leader in Wabanaki Studies and local Black History coordinator. So for her, she's doing the vertical team, but we're writing an entire pre-K through 12 curriculum for Wabanaki Studies and local Black History. And then the teams have a lot of teachers on them. They are, that's on top of what they're doing for teaching. So they attend meetings, and if they're doing curriculum writing, they get paid additional teacher hours for that work.
Okay.
Does that clarify?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, perfect. And okay. So when I look at on the mental health and behavior, this is so important to me. I try to see, when I see here the people who are working on from the central office, those are all the central work happening there, or everything is being also spread to the building level. So we can try to decentralize the work from the central building going straight spread to the building as well.
Yeah. Let me see if I'll answer and then tell me if I didn't get it right. But yeah, I mean, we are very much want to have resources in buildings with interfacing directly with students. So there's two people there. One of them is an assistant clinical director. That's a fully grant funded position. And she oversees and supports the entire social work department.
Okay.
And so she's doing case consultation, which you'll understand, professional development, coordination, all of that, working with administrators. And then the other person is the director, and he's responsible for all of that coordination, resource management, et cetera, for all the social emotional learning, PBIS, restorative practices. And so, yeah, he's the only person looking at all of those things system-wide, pre-K through 12. And then he's collaborating with people in the schools. So for example, he meets monthly with our APs. They meet monthly with the social work team. So they are the people coordinating those collaborative structures to pull people from schools together to do that shared learning.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a teamwork, right? So it's not like one person has the burden or everything, but
no, it's like we have, I'll give you an example. We have PBIS, right? Is the system we use for thinking about common expectations and responses to when students don't meet the common expectation. So what he would do is he's working with every building to make sure they have what we call tiered fidelity inventory, which is a diagnostic of what systems do you have in place. Right. So he's either doing those directly, or he's working with folks at the state to come in and he's coordinating, setting them up to make those happen. Then he's synthesizing that data for us and helping us see trends so that we can figure out, okay, all of the schools need to work on common expectations, as an example. So he's doing like that. Then he's leading a district PBIS team. He's pushing up professional development. He's allocating resources when we see, okay, consistently we have gaps with data. He's setting up training, all that kind of stuff around that one piece.
Right. Thank you. And my last question is that I see some addition here on the IT and HR. So those requests should be on the top of what we already allocated, or so that means when I look at the IT, I think I look at here, we have eight FTs already. Those we have them currently.
Yep.
So we just need to add 7 more to make them 15.
Right. What was in each department slide is what is currently funded total. And then it's noted how much of it's local. And then in the subsequent slide where it said add 7, that was the recommendation from the analysis, the external group in that report that's attached there in board docs. They recommended that we increase from, at that time it was 7, but they and they were looking at both the data team and the technician team. So that was, let's see how many of them, I don't remember off the top of my head. So IT was 7 at that time because we have increased by 1 FTE since we had that report. And then there are 4 on the data team. So at the time of the report, it was total, there were 11 FTE, and they were recommending to go to 18 FTE. We have in that time added 1. So we have a kind of difference of still 6 more.
So can we get, maybe it's not the report. Can we get some of the job description, what those or those addition they will supply for.
Yeah, and in that
Maybe follow
report,
up.
there's
It's not
significant,
something that I want now, but just to have a clear, adding on some F, just want to see what we need, what kind of expertise we're missing.
the report that's attached, there's a specific report that's attached on board docs that goes into fairly significant detail there.
The same thing for the HR?
The HR one doesn't have this. It wasn't the same kind of analysis. I mean, but we can provide those. So the generalists is the
because those are large numbers, right? And we need to add and I look at it. Mm-hmm. So the one we're proposing on the end here, those are mostly the requests for the FY24. Those are mostly, some of them, they've been on the grant funding. We try to move them to the local budget or?
Yep, that's correct. Some of them are new requests, and we'll talk through all of that in the coming weeks.
So I pay attention because I look at the Wabanaki study coach where we need it because we have, so we go with details when we come to the budget. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Other questions? Oh, yes. Board Member Opperman, take it away.
Still have a little bit of energy left. Looking over DEI and HR and seeing some overlap when you're looking at adding to those, the extra above what the two have combined. Mm-hmm. Is there any reorganization of that, those departments to kind of, I mean, for example, recruitment is in both of them and all, and that, right. And I understand there's a different flavor to the recruitment and all, but essentially recruitment is recruiting, mm-hmm. So I mean, there's some things that don't overlap, but any thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Yeah.
So we just recently restructured for it to have this distinction with the kind of the HR strategy and some of the operational functions. Mm-hmm. So that was a design on purpose in order to invest or to put that attention toward things like our recruitment strategy. And on the DEB team, it's that internal pathways piece. So I mean, I think we are still reflecting on that, especially with all these HR ads. But I mean, partly what I'm hearing behind your question, so I'm saying it transparently in case this is not at all behind your question,
okay.
But is there inefficiency by having two teams think about recruitment? And so I think it's very clear and very distinct what they are doing, which is not overlapping, but it's coordinated. Mm-hmm. So at this point, I think there's nothing that's been added that's sort of overlapping. But yeah, I mean, we could spell that out more clearly if it's helpful, especially if we're going to advance any HR ads.
Yeah. That would be good.
Yeah.
Other questions from folks? Could you just one more time explain the last slide before the question, like where those requests are coming from? I know we're going to go into them more in detail, but I'm unclear the pipeline to get this list of things.
Yeah. Do you want me to do a crack?
Sure.
Or do you want to do it? No. Okay. So it's a combination of positions that are in ESSER that we want to hold on to. So they would, so since our budget strategy is to look at our local plus our ESSER as one pot. And so anything in ESSER is something we are making a decision about, are we advancing it or not? And then new requests that come through the departments. So like, for example, an example of a new request would be, third, things that had other grant funding sources that have gone away. So the literacy coach was funded out of other grants, not ESSER. That money we don't have available for next year. So that shows up here as a request, even though it's just keeping Cindy Sewell, who's doing all the literacy work. But it would show up here. Okay. Whereas another thing like, you do the custodians.
No, so another new request from a department, right, is, on this list is 4.25 additional custodians. So, that's a new request to kind of meet the need. We've experienced a lot of custodians being out. We have actually positions filled in the custodial department, but we have a number of folks who are out on leave. And so we're struggling to kind of compensate for that. So this is a request coming to kind of compensate for some of those challenges to be able to provide, the kind of standard of, custodial care that we want for our buildings. So that's another example.
And I think one thing that might be a little confusing that I'm just thinking as we did this is that we talked about all this district-wide teams. And so something like the custodians get baked in, they're placed in schools, right? So it's not that district-wide coordination, coherence stuff, but we wanted to just make visible positions that are coming through those operational departments that are not schools. So that's why some of those kinds of positions are reflected here as well for transparency.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, and with this list, you're saying that this is the list of needs that we have. You're not saying we're going to fill all of these or we're not going to fill all of these. This is just like needs, period.
This is needs, period.
Okay.
Just pertaining to operational functions and these district-wide departments. So, and we do this and with folks who are new, it's important. We want you to understand what we believe is needed to provide the right level of service. And so that when we are obviously going to be faced with hard choices, that there's transparency into that process of, and that there's awareness. If we're not going to have the staffing levels, then there's a calibration of expectation of what's realistic, whether it's a student experience or what we're able to do to support staff on the back end. So we just want people to have that understanding.
I think that last piece that you said feels really important to me, just in terms of like what we've heard from people working in the district over the last few months as we've been talking to folks just about, I think that there is this idea that the district-wide positions are too big or there's too much and it needs to be reinvested in other ways. But I think that this is like a really strong argument, and what we saw in payroll, that's not true. Like I was doing math as we were going through about the ratios that are in these departments. Reminding people we have almost 2,000 employees and over 6,000 students. Like just thinking about in IT, that's 1,000 just personal devices that one person is responsible for. I can't keep track of my own laptop, and just, thinking about in payroll, some of the things that were frustrations were that we didn't have enough people to get back to people in the ways that they expected. Right. And so I think that this is a really big trade-off that we have to be considering, and it's super complex. Right. And I think that I would just really encourage the board to look at these numbers and understand through the reports, like the value that these investments give our district.
Yeah. And I just want to make a comment there, and I appreciate you saying that, because I think, one of our goals for Erin and me has been pertaining to our culture and building back a sense of connection and trust. And I do think it can be really hard to be on these teams and to feel, from a retention perspective, as you know, it's hard to retain people because it's an overwhelming body of work that's invisible to most people. And so when people talk about that's a non-essential team, or, that's where we should cut, just because you don't understand, which is total. How would you ever understand, what I do every day? That creates that kind of scarcity context and mindset, which I don't believe is good for a healthy, thriving organization. And so I think sort of creating that empathy and ability to sort of step in each other's shoes is important for the culture, because a strong culture is one of the most important things we can do to provide quality education for our students. So that dynamic is very much at play, and I appreciate you surfacing that, because that's hard when you can't get back to people, even though you're completely overwhelmed. Right. And then you're, get a lot of criticism for not being able to meet expectations even. Yeah.
And I would just imagine that probably also feels really hard as an employee to know that you're not able to support people in the ways that you can or would like to.
Yeah.
So just recognizing that as well. Any other questions from folks? Yeah, Board Member Opperman?
One specific one, just for information, are the 4.25 FTEs the ones that are getting refunded from ESSER?
Are you talking about the custodial?
Custodials, yeah. Are those previously?
No,
That's not the ESSERF ones that were
No.
funded?
mm-mm.
Okay, because I know that's a change
Yeah.
on base.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, when Miranda's on, we'll be able to, that can be a follow-up question, but no is the short answer. These are over and above what are currently budgeted custodians.
Okay, that we're going to have come back on regular budget
Yep. And
as they were on ESSER.
Yep. And the prior, budget director and Miranda have been managing that, but
Okay.
these 4.25 are in addition to.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for all of that information and for everybody that's fed information into that. Really, really helpful.
Yeah.
I think we might be done. We already adjourned. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.